What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in this week. Today, we are talking about an absolute fundamental of your musicianship. This is something that, if you take the time to get it together, will take your playing from sounding like somebody who's still sort of in process and getting it together to somebody who sounds like a really complete, mature musician. This is playing in tune. Playing in tune is one of the easiest things for us to neglect in our practice. It's something that for a long time, I never really invested the practice time that I needed to in. Some of that was because maybe I thought I play okay in tune, or nobody ever really directed me to practice some of the things we're going to talk about today. But whenever I would listen back to recordings of myself, that would be the number one thing that I wouldn't like about my playing, of just like, Sean, you got to play more in tune. So I don't know why it took me so long to start working on this, but several years ago, I started to make it an incredibly regular part of my practice. Literally, I practice this every single day in the ways we're going to talk about. And that has really strengthened that muscle so much. So I really encourage you to try some of these approaches. Whether you think you're somebody who plays super in tune all the time or you struggle with intonation, it's a lifelong battle. The better you get at hearing intonation, the more you're going to start to hear smaller and smaller indiscretions. So it's never something you really totally master, but you're always going to be sort of in process of playing more and more in tune. All right, let's jump right into it. We're going to talk about a 3-step process today. This is the way that I think all of us should work on intonation. Whether we're actually active improvisers or not, we're going to use a little bit of improvisation today, but these steps will really get you there. So step number 1, we're not going to linger here too long. This is probably the most obvious one for all of us. That is to know the tendencies of your instrument, the tendencies of which partials tend to be sharp and flat, the tendencies of your specific horn. While we have all of these, typical things that the harmonic series gives us or that a brass instrument gives us, for example, like when we play our high F, we know that that is going to be a little farther out than where we would normally play first position. Or when we play a high G, we know it's going to be in a little bit from where we normally play second position. These are going to be pretty typical across all trombones. However, there are going to be some partials that can be a little squirrely for you. The high B flat partial, for example, I tend to find on different horns that I play, it really sits in lots of different places. On this particular horn, I have to pull out a little bit to be in tune. But a couple years ago, I was playing on another horn, a different brand, and that one, I was actually a little flat on that note. But then some of my colleagues would play that horn, and they were in tune. So much of it has to do with sort of like how you're interacting with the instrument. So you got to know those tendencies, have a really developed sense of where all the notes actually are, as far as adjustment, and then practice that stuff. The way to get there is doing etudes, doing Bordoni etudes, doing that sort of stuff, and really taking the time to get with the tuner, maybe write in your music like, oh, I've got a high G, I got to pull that down. If you haven't invested that type of practice there, you got to do that stuff. We're not going to spend time talking about that today, but that is step 1, just to developing an understanding of like where this stuff actually is on your horn. All right, step 2. Now this is something that I've talked about a handful of other times here on the channel, but today we're really taking like a full-on dive into it. This is using drone pitches as a way to train your ear about how to hear intonation. Ultimately, we need to hear these things to be able to make the small adjustments that we need to in the moment when we're actually performing. So to start with, if you're not so sure if you know how to hear intonation with the drone, you got to set up a drone pitch. Lots of different ways you can do this. For today's lesson, I'm using just a software synth that's in my DAW, but you could use lots of different apps. The one that I particularly love is the Tonal Energy app. It allows you to set up any number of drone pitches to play against. It will also detect your pitch while the drone is occurring, which is very useful if you are in the process of training your ear. So that's a really great one, but anything that will create a drone is going to work for you here. So you start by just doing single pitches to see if you can be in tune. So this example, I'm going to start on a concert C above the staff, and I'm going to start, or at least try to be as in tune as possible when I start, and then I'm going to intentionally drift out of tune and back into tune, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we are listening for when we're listening for intonation. So as I moved in and out of tune, you could probably hear the little waves in the sound. That is really what we're listening for. Relatively easy and clear to hear on a usin. It becomes a little more complicated when we have chords, but you will still hear that same little wave in the sound. And a lot of times I think, especially the closer you are to intonation or being really in tune, it's almost like you feel the intonation more than you hear it necessarily. So that's something you really have to work with to be able to get to that place. Once we've got single notes working with the drone and we can play pretty in tune with the single note, next I'd encourage you to move to the consonant sounding notes against that drone. So here we're going to be playing in C. So our notes we're going to reference against the drone are going to be the 5th of the key, the 4th of the key, and the 3rd of the key. Especially the 5th is going to be particularly easy to hear if it's in tune. The 4th is relatively easy to hear, especially when you sort of think it's resolving to the 3rd. That can be a great way to hear the intonation here. And then the 3rd is going to be in tune as well. But if you know a little bit about temperament of intonation, you're actually going to have to lower that note just a little bit more than you would usually lower it to make it sound perfectly in tune. Now, when we're improvising, I don't know that we're really thinking about that too much because we're playing with lots of instruments that have equal temperament, that do not use just temperament, pianos, guitars, that sort of stuff. The chords that we play are pretty dense in jazz, very chromatic. So some of those just temperament issues, we may not concern ourselves with. Maybe if it was a chorale or something like that. But I would say our goal really as an improvising musician is to really be like in tune on the E in this case as much as we can, rather than necessarily feeling like I have to drop it that 13 cents to make it perfectly in tune. Now, no promises on any of this stuff today that I'm playing it, nailing it in tune. Like I said, this is a work in progress for all of us. I think I'm pretty solid on these sort of exercises because I do them regularly, but still, it's a lot has to do with, sort of how your embouchure is feeling that day. You might kind of be a little out of tune on a note and then quickly adjust. That's really what it's about. That's why listening is so important. So once we've got those consonant notes working, then we're going to add all of the notes of the scale and just play the scale up, down, whatever direction you want to, nice and slow, really listening how that note lines up against the drone. Now, if you're using an app or a program where you can generate multiple notes, when you go to the scale, that can be really useful. A lot of times when I do this, I'm either using the root, the 5th, and then the higher root, or the root, the 5th, and then the 9. That just gives you a few other notes to sort of reference against, and especially for us as improvisers, it gives us a more realistic setting that we would have to be listening for intonation in. Cool. That is step number 2. So if you stopped there, you knew your pitch tendencies and your partial tendencies and had done a little practice there, you've invested some time in these major scales doing them with the drone, you would be a long way down the path to being able to play in tune, regardless of style, improvisation, anything like that. If you want to take this into a more improvisatory setting, and I think that's really where we as jazz musicians and improvisers need to work on this, especially trombone players. I wouldn't say trombone is necessarily a harder instrument to play in tune. It's just a really easy instrument to play out of tune. And so you just have to really make sure you are policing yourself. So our next step is to take that similar approach, almost like we were playing that scale, but actually do it in an improvised fashion through whatever types of chord qualities you might want to. So if we start with major, just improvising in the major scale, and I know for me, I'm particularly listening for those consonant intervals, and then also listening to the 4th resolving to the 3rd, and trying to get that to really sound in tune. From there, we can move to any other sound, mode, whatever we want to do. So if we think about the Lydian sound, go to sort of a brighter version of major, some of that stuff is going to maintain the same, but we have the addition of the sharp 11 in here. So I really like to listen for how the fifth and the sharp 11 sort of rub up against each other to kind of inform me about what that half step going down to the sharp 11 really feels like, and then it resolves back up to the fifth of the chord. If we move to the minor side, maybe we think about the Dorian mode. Again, those open intervals, fifths, that's going to be a really good reference point. Here, I really love to listen for how the major sixth sounds against this drone when I'm hearing sort of a minor tonality. That's a very colorful note when we hit it on a minor chord. And so it's a good one to really make sure we're hearing in tune, so that when we want to play it, we're actually putting it where it belongs and not just sort of having it be out of tune. I left the drone the same here, but you could make a minor drone instead if you so desired. And finally, really getting some crunch in here. If we go all the way to like a flat 9 chord, so half whole diminished, we get a lot of more dissonant intervals, and I really like to try to listen for those. So for example, really listening for the flat 9 resolving to the root, again that sharp 11 resolving to the 5, maybe thinking about some of the typical patterns I might play in diminished, and how do those sound against this drone. So here, for my drone, I usually use the root, the fifth, and then the high root. I don't want to use the 9 here because this scale has a flat 9 in it. You could certainly add whatever you want in here, but you just want to have a few additional notes to reference against as you're playing through these different sounds. So that is it. That is how I have practiced intonation over the last probably about 3 years. Like I said, I never practiced this when I was a younger musician, much to my detriment. It was just something that I don't really know why my teachers never encouraged me to. I'm sure I was playing randomly out of tune. Maybe I just had a lot of other stuff that I needed to work on. That's entirely possible. But if you invest some time here, it really will make a huge difference in your playing. It might not happen in a week or even 2 weeks, but give it a month of steady practice. Carve out 5 minutes in your practice session to do some of this drone work. I guarantee you will start to hear the pitch better. And you might find that, okay, well, I do play pretty in tune. Or you might find that, whoa, I am not as in tune as I thought I was. I've got some work to do in this area like I needed to starting a couple years ago. Cool. See you in the woodshed.